Welcome to a special edition of Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway. Gayatri's away, the birth of our second child being imminent, God willing, and she'll be back in due course. This is a special edition because, as you can see behind me, we are at Westminster. If you look closely, you'll see the flag at half-mast, you'll see the helicopters circling, you'll even hear a siren or two. Because this week was the site of a vicious, cowardly terrorist attack which mowed down innocent civilians on the Westminster Bridge over my shoulder, killing women, injuring people in significant numbers, even throwing one woman over the wall and into the river a long way beneath her. She was fished out alive. Others were not successfully saved. A policeman, one that I knew in the House of Commons, lost his life defending the House of Commons and democracy itself from an assault by a crazed man bearing a large knife, about which more later. Because my very special guest for this special Sputnik is Peter Ford, formerly Britain's ambassador to Syria and to Bahrain, an expert in the Middle East, an expert on the swamp of bitterness from which all of this has emerged. I'm very glad to say he joins me now on the Sputnik. Peter, let me start by saying that just a few short years ago in the building behind me, I was trapped in a lift with the then Foreign Secretary, William Hague. Imagine his consternation. Trapped in a lift with me, unable to move, just him and me. And I said this to him: William, you've been wrong before. In fact, you've been wrong most of your life. But you've never been insane before. The policy you're following in Syria is literally insane. Why? Because the encouraging of young men with knives to go and fight in Syria is insane, not just of itself, but because one day those men will be back with their knives in this building, looking for you and looking for me. And yesterday, I watched it all come true in front of my eyes. What were your thoughts as that news was breaking?
Well, you were obviously very prescient, George, and I was shocked, of course, by the events. And then I was surprised by the reaction of our Prime Minister. She saw fit to say that this was an attack on our values, that we would hold fast to our normal lives. What gave her the right to make this false interpretation of the terrorist incident? Why did she not accept that there was a clear link with our own policies in the Middle East? Yesterday, was it coincidence? Probably not. A meeting in Washington of all the great powers ranged against ISIS. Boris Johnson was there. Was it just coincidence? I doubt it. Was it just coincidence that this week has seen the bombing in Mosul reach a climax with hundreds of people being killed, most of them civilians, far more than were killed in Aleppo? Surely what happened was a reflection of these political events in which we had a part in the Middle East. She appeared to be trying to put up a smokescreen about values and all that to disguise the fact that politicians have taken decisions which have caused or brought these chickens home to roost. some of us pointed out a year ago when the decision was made to start bombing Syria, that sooner or later there would be a price to pay. Now the government want to hide this fact from the public. And I think it's disgraceful. Her remarks were fatuous. She owes it to the public to level with them, to say that we, the government, think it worthwhile. Arguably, it is worthwhile, but be honest about it, that these are chickens coming home to roost. This is the price we've got to be ready to pay if we want to indulge our British penchant for bombing countries in the Middle East.
I think that's very powerfully put. We'll come back in a moment to the fact that there is a real problem of fanaticism and extremism on the fringes of Islam. I know it well. I've been up close and personal with it. They've tried to kill me. But there seems little doubt that the incident yesterday and other incidents like it in Nice, in Paris, in Brussels, in Berlin, in Germany, these incidents are of course connected to the foreign policy of the West in the Middle East. I don't think there's any sentient being out there who doubts that. It's only the politicians and their media echo chamber who like to try to deny it. Let's take Syria for our first example. Britain, your friends, former friends in the British Foreign Office, have willfully followed a policy these last 5 years nearly of supporting people whose allegiance is to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In other words, sending the message that it's all right for ISIS and Al-Qaeda to murder people in Syria, to cut the throats of priests in Syria, whilst feigning outrage when the same kind of people, motivated by the same mindset, do the same kind of things here. That contradiction is too great to be ignored.
Absolutely, and this policy continues to this day. The government continued to demonize Assad as a butcher, and then express or feign surprise when Muslim youths in this country take it seriously and want to go out and do jihad against the butcher. David Cameron could be sued by some of these youths for breach of promise, I think. And to this day, just 2 days ago, the spokeswoman in the House of Lords, Baroness Annalay, said that the British government are supporting moderates such as those currently fighting the government in the suburbs of Damascus known as the Eastern Ghouta. Well, even opposition sources recognize that the fighters in Eastern Ghouta are led by Al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate. They're leading a campaign which is tellingly called Worshippers of God Come Together and Resist the Butcher. I rest my case. We are giving material and moral support to the kind of people in Syria that we abhor as vile terrorists in London.
This all started, didn't all start, but the proximate cause of what we look at today is the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which you knew, I knew, almost everybody in the Foreign Office knew, was a very bad idea. And we now know from Chilcot that almost everyone across the river there in the security services knew would be a bad idea, knew would have the dreadful consequences and blowback that it did, yet the government proceeded with it. We could put that down to an aberration, the Blair aberration, if it had not been repeated all over again and again, first in Libya and then in Syria. What is it about Britain that propels it into this perpetual succession of attacks and occupations of other people's lands.
Well, how long have you got, George?
For you, any length of time.
Briefly, two reasons. It's a post-imperial instinct, a spasm to wreak mayhem in the countries of the brown people. And secondly, it's kowtowing to America. Both those factors came heavily into play
in Iraq.
Yeah. And
in Libya,
again, in
arguably,
Syria.
we were pushing the Americans.
Indeed, we were egged on by the French, which would have been a repeat of the Suez fiasco. We almost repeated it in Syria. You'll recall in 2013, the Commons bravely, a number of brave MPs voted against a government motion to start bombing the Syrian army, thank God, and that changed history. Many saw this as a lapse by Britain, that we were not standing up for Western values, but on the contrary, it was a last spasm of good sense from our parliament and politicians.
I spoke in that debate along with, in fact, right after the late Gerald Kaufman. There were 4 speeches in the middle of the debate, 2 Tories, 2 on the opposition side. I feel that we played a part in winning that very slim majority, and it did change history. But they returned for more, didn't they? Not this time to bomb the Syrian army, but purportedly to bomb the people who are fighting the Syrian army. What was that about? How did that contradiction emerge?
Well, I think the government probably felt under pressure from the Americans to join the campaign in Syria. You'll recall that ISIS became more and more powerful in Syria in 2014, 2015. I think the government felt that they had to do their bit by America. As always, it's about us playing the role of trusty lieutenant, or if you like, tonto, which in Spanish means stupid. That is our role.
That is a fantastic note to end the first half of the show. The good news is you've agreed to stay with us for the second. Peter Ford, Ambassador for Britain in Syria and other Middle Eastern countries. Be right back after this. Welcome back to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway, and Peter Ford, former British ambassador in Damascus, in Bahrain, and a specialist in the Arab Middle East and in the broader Muslim world. And it's about that we're talking, with Parliament behind us in the week that saw yet another terrorist attack on civilian people in the streets and outside the Parliament building itself. Peter, thanks very much for staying. Terrorism exists. It's a real thing. It's not false flags. It's not Israelis dressed up as Muslims or any of the other nonsensical conspiracy theories. It exists. Extremists exist in the Muslim community. Western governments have done their best to inflate it, but there have always been the Wahhabist mentality, hundreds of years old. Is pretty extreme and encourages extremism. As long as this extremism is growing and is a clear and present danger, how do we defend ourselves here in Britain against it? Mm.
Well, the first thing is to stop making the situation worse. You touched on it just now. We have to stop encouraging the flow of young potential jihadis from this country and we are encouraging it by demonizing the Assad government. David Cameron kept calling Assad a butcher, so it's not surprising his young men go out there. That's the first thing. We should stop making it worse. We should also stop making it worse by trying to overthrow the secular government of Syria. This is absolutely inane, George. It's absolutely inane. But you could see, looking across the sweep of the Middle East, that whenever we see a secular government, we try to overthrow it.
It's extraordinary.
Iraq, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, all had secular governments, and we paved the way for Islamist extremists. Fortunately, in Syria, we haven't been totally successful, but we have been instrumental in causing this wave of jihadism.
Is that stupidity, or is there a cunning plan of which I don't have the capacity to work out?
I certainly don't think it's a cunning plan. I don't think the Foreign Office is up to cunning plans.
More Austin Powers than James Bond.
Exactly. Since my day, anyway.
Indeed.
I think there's a failure of analysis, a failure to recognize the phenomenon for what it is, which is mainly Sunni revanchism. Specifically Sunni. It's not Islamist extremism, it's Sunni Islamist extremism. 99.9% of the acts of terror carried out in Iraq, Syria, and the West are carried out by Sunni extremists. But it's taboo to mention this, partly, I suspect, because, of course, the countries, the rich oil-producing countries of the Gulf are all Sunnis. And therefore, we mustn't go there. We mustn't offend them by saying that it's Sunni extremists who are the crux of the issue. Instead, we prefer to demonize Iran, which is a predominantly Shia country, which has absolutely no hand in any of the terrorism that we see on our streets. And yet we demonize Iran more than we do Saudi Arabia. We demonize Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Shia movement, militia, even though they are helping to keep the peace in Lebanon, prevent that country boiling over, and are fighting the jihadis, who we profess not to like, in Syria. Our analysis is wrong, we're totally inconsistent, and as always, it comes back to the way we have to kowtow to the Americans. Because the Americans have wanted it this way, we rationalize it so that we can go along with it. It's now going to be very interesting to see if this calculus changes with Trump. We're opening a new chapter of discussion here, but it's feasible that Trump in the coming months will complete his own assessment of the situation in Syria and Iraq and say, hey, it's time we stopped actively trying to overthrow this secular regime. We're not going to help them, but we're just going to stop trying to overthrow them, and you guys need to follow suit. At that point, maybe common sense will break in on the Foreign Office and Number 10.
That will be a particular challenge, and indeed it will be not since Suez that we will have had an American government with a more sane foreign policy towards the Middle East than a British government. At least in the 1956 episode over Suez, Britain was still at least seen as a world power. Now we're actually not. We are tonto, as you absolutely memorably put it. We go around the world threatening everyone with America's army. But if America's army is refocused and reevaluated, that's going to leave the British Foreign Office and the British Prime Minister either up the creek without a paddle or having to row back pretty quickly. Which will it be, do you think?
Well, I think the British government are beginning to negotiate for themselves an exit route on Syria. They've started to say, we think there's no place for Assad in the future of Syria, but if the people of Syria so decide, they're leaving themselves wiggle room, I think, and this is new.
Peter, it's necessary to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but it's not sufficient. If one defeats them, they'll be back under another name and not very long distant afterwards. Because the material conditions that have spawned these extremist phenomena continue to exist.
Indeed, but ISIS themselves are not going to go very far, that they will be leaving sleeper cells that could be re-emerge at any point. I mean, we saw in Syria how they lost Palmyra and then came back and lost it again. It's a game of whack-a-mole, which is going on here. You whack them in one place and they pop up in another, and this is very hard to get on top of. Already we see signs that ISIS are moving camp to southern Syria, and indeed to the Golan even, where they can sup with their Israeli friends in an interesting de facto alliance.
It's quite a pantomime horse, that one.
Yes.
But you're right. There's clear examples of the most weird arrangements. There's some ISIS material seized yesterday, anti-aircraft material, which had clearly come from the United States, and it was seized from ISIS in Mosul. So the weird and wonderful pattern of relations has not gone away. No, of course you're right. Even ISIS itself will continue to exist in one form or another. But isn't it overwhelmingly true that our long support for dictatorship of various kinds in the Middle East has not just dictatorships, but failed dictatorships who couldn't even make the trains run on time, has produced this swamp out of which all this comes?
I'm not sure I'd go along with that. I think casting my eye across the regimes that would fit that description, I don't think we had any role in keeping the Assad government's father and son in power. On the contrary, we've been against the Ba'athist rule for many, many
we were quite
years.
close to Saddam, on the other hand. We gave Saddam every encouragement to attack Iran.
And it's certainly true of the regimes in the Gulf. We have propped up regimes in the Gulf with no thought for consequences, and regimes in Jordan and to some extent Egypt. But Syria is, as in many things, a different case.
It is. It's a different kettle of fish altogether. Isn't the center of all of this Saudi Arabia, the fountainhead, financial fountainhead, ideological, theological fountainhead, the money, the treasury of this extremism? And yet our monarchs, ministers, and grandees of all kinds have the closest possible relationship. I sat for nearly 30 years in Parliament being told by government ministers that Saudi Arabia was our best friend and closest ally in the Middle East, notwithstanding all that I've just said about it.
It's very sad. I served in Saudi Arabia. I have Saudi friends. There are many admirable things about how the Saudis have modernized, and also we have to understand their internal constraints. They have had a long history of Wahhabism. Some more modernizing governments have tried a little bit to reform. But you're right, essentially, Saudi Arabia has not been on the side of the good guys. Saudi Arabia has given at least spiritual support to extremism. If you want to know what life is like in Raqqa under ISIS, just go to any provincial town in Saudi Arabia. It's curious, indeed, that ISIS have not really turned their attention to Saudi Arabia. Is it because they've taken their inspiration from Saudi? They see nothing to change there? Is it because they're being paid protection money? That's an interesting pairing.
Frankly, probably a mixture of all of those things. You asked me earlier, how long have I got? All I can say to you is I wish I had longer, but alas, I don't. Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria, also with the UNRWA, the United Nations agency that does so much, indeed is the only agency that does anything at all for Palestinian refugees. It's been an honor, a privilege to interview you today here on the Sputnik. That's, alas, all we've got time for in this special edition of Sputnik. Join us again next week, but meanwhile, let's remember those who were killed or injured in this week's terrorist attack.